Political war over Iran's potential for nuclear war. Republicans pursue sanctions. President Obama promises a veto, and now another world leader is involved. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Brett Baer. The Senate wants a say in the president's negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. The president is promising to veto any new or increased sanctions and basically telling Republicans to stay out of it. That's a recipe for a political mushroom cloud here in Washington. And Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel tells us tonight Republicans are lighting the fuse in an unusual way.
I've invited Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to address a joint session of Congress on the grave threats of radical Islam and the threat that Iran poses.
Hours after the State of the Union, Boehner invited Netanyahu to speak to lawmakers on February 11th in what is seen as an unprecedented move.
I did not consult with the White House. The Congress can make this decision on its own. I don't believe I'm poking anyone in the eye. There is a serious threat that exists in the world. And the president last night kind of papered over it.
Last night, the president reiterated his call for Congress to stand down on new sanctions and made this claim.
Our diplomacy is at work with respect to Iran, where for the first time in a decade we've halted the progress of its nuclear program and reduced its stockpile of nuclear material.
Yet many don't believe Iran has halted anything related to its nuclear program, and even some top Democrats worry the administration may cut a bad deal.
Iran is clearly taking steps that can only be interpreted as provocative. Yet the administration appears willing to excuse away any connection between these developments and signs of Iran's bad faith in negotiations.
That comment is not a surprise to administration officials after Menendez expressed his concerns directly to the president last week. Today, the Deputy Secretary of State struck a hopeful tone.
Our assessment remains that we have a credible chance to reach a deal that's in the best interests of America's security as well as that of our allies and partners. Our goal is to conclude the major elements of the deal by the end of March, and then to complete the technical details by June.
The new Foreign Relations Chairman, Republican Bob Corker, vented about a failure to keep Congress in the loop.
Consultations up until this point have been a phone call in the morning that something is happening, and generally speaking, while we're receiving that phone call, we're reading the New York Times or someone else reports.
Meanwhile, Arizona Republican Jeff Flake urged his colleagues to be cautious.
The purpose of sanctions is to get parties to the table. They are at the table, and so I'm confused by the notion that some would want to impose additional sanctions while negotiations are going on.
Yet Idaho Republican Jim Risch suggested the administration is being duped by Tehran.
I think you guys are being bamboozled. I really do. And I hope you can come in here someday and say, ha, you doofus, you had no idea what you're talking about. I don't think that's going to happen.
Fear of a bad deal is why many lawmakers support passing a bill to give Congress final authorization of any agreement with Tehran. Some say they don't need regular consultation, but need to know the final package is a good deal for the U.S. Brett?
Mike Emanuel live on the Hill. Mike, thank you. Now to another major hotspot, Yemen. It's difficult to know just who is in charge there tonight. One thing is certain. The situation there is extremely fluid. National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin is watching it all tonight from the Pentagon.
A day after Iranian-backed Shiite militants stormed the presidential palace in Yemen's capital, surrounding President Abed Hadi inside his home, Yemeni officials and state-run media said both sides had agreed to a truce. The Pentagon and State Department refused to call it a coup.
The legitimate Yemeni government is led by President Hadi. We remain in touch with him. He is in his home. Clearly, we've seen a breakdown in the institutions in Yemen, and obviously there's a great deal of violence and tension on the ground,
including reports that the Houthi militants overtook a ballistic missile base near the capital, leading to concerns that Yemen's Scud missiles could fall into the wrong hands.
Let's be clear. The Houthis are armed trained, and operating on behalf of the government of Iran. And they've been very patient and very deliberate about this over the last 15 years. The long game is to extend Iranian influence on both sides of the Gulf.
The U.S. government has spent $275 million in recent years in counterterrorism aid to Yemen's military for it to fight al-Qaeda. The leader of the Houthi militants had this message for the UN.
I would like to tell the Security Council that any measures that they are taking to subdue our country or to shut us up in order to pass this conspiracy will not benefit you at all. We are prepared to face any consequences.
The USS Iwo Jima and the Fort McHenry remained on station off the coast of Yemen in the Red Sea in the event that the U.S. Embassy needed to be evacuated. In the past year, the U.S. increased security at the embassy, sending a fast team of Marines and members of the Special Marine Air Ground Task Force, the rapid reaction force created in the wake of Benghazi from Rota, Spain.
Things are quiet in Yemen as of a little while ago. Our personnel are well protected. We have a very bare minimum of diplomatic personnel presence and a strong security presence.
As part of the truce, the Houthi militants will leave the presidential palace and pull back from the president's residence in exchange for more representation in the government. But such truces have broken down before, Brett.
Jennifer Griffin live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. We'll be watching this one. President Obama has just finished up some remarks to an audience in Boise, Idaho, and will soon be on his way to Kansas. He's back in campaign mode, promoting the tax and spend program he outlined in Tuesday's State of the Union address. Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry tonight with reaction to a long list of promises and pronouncements.
President Obama hit the red state of Idaho today to send the signal he can work with the new Republican Congress.
I'm not going to stop trying to make our politics work better.
Republicans teed off on the president for how that contrasts with the hyper-partisanship in last night's State of the Union, where he did not even acknowledge the GOP won the midterms, while getting in this jab when Republicans offered mock applause about the president leaving office soon.
I have no more campaigns to run. My only agenda, I know because I won both of them.
Liberal groups rejoiced and said the president sounded a lot more like Senator Elizabeth Warren, with the Progressive Change Campaign Committee declaring, quote, on issues like taxing the rich and making college affordable, the president took giant steps in the right direction. Though Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was not mentioned at all by the president, suggested the veto threats will result in little actual deal-making.
This kind of partisanship is what we've become accustomed to from the president.
The presidential oversights may be due to the fact that some key lines from this policy address.
This country does best when everyone gets their fair shot. Everyone does their fair share. Everyone plays by the same set of rules.
Were literally ripped from the 2012 campaign.
America's always done best when everybody's got a fair shot and everybody's doing their fair share. And everybody plays by the same rules.
And while the president was cheerleading economic gains by declaring it's time to turn the page on the Great Recession,
the shadow of crisis has passed, and the State of the Union is strong.
Republicans suggested the president was also trying to turn the page on terror by making sure the phrase al-Qaeda was not mouthed in a State of the Union for the first time since 9/11.
I think he defies the reality of the threats out there in the world as it relates to radical Islamist extremism. And I think that's a very dangerous policy.
Though the president's senior advisor, Valerie Jarrett, defended the president for also using the phrase violent extremism instead of Islamic extremism.
Before we start throwing around labels, let's look more broadly at terrorism. Let's not limit it. Let's look broadly at it, and let's attack it together.
In the official Republican response, Senator Joni Ernst did not mention deficits or debt at all, while the president touted a shrinking annual deficit and left out the fine print about how the national debt has continued to soar.
I think the one that takes the most chutzpah, the most gall, is for him to say, we have been reducing, we've cut the deficit more than any other president. Well, if you quadruple it to begin with, you can lessen the deficit.
After visiting Boise State today, the President's Roadshow continues tomorrow at the University of Kansas, reprising an old campaign tactic where he goes to college campuses to drum up support. Brett?
Ed Henry, live on the North Lawn. Ed, thank you. Up next, some of the people who want to replace President Obama react to his State of the Union address. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 25 in Boston, where the cardiac surgeon shot at Brigham and Women's Hospital yesterday has succumbed to his injuries. Dr. Michael Davidson was shot twice, reportedly by the 55-year-old son of a patient who had recently died. The shooter then killed himself. Fox 35 in Richmond, Virginia, with an update of last week's grapevine about a state lawmaker just reelected despite being jailed for a sex scandal with a 17-year-old. Joseph Morrissey is facing new charges of forgery and perjury. Morrissey says the charges are false and he'll go to court to fight them. And this is a live look at snowy Philadelphia from Fox 29. Some tourists there got quite a surprise. They ran up the steps of the Museum of Art and ran into the real Rocky. The three had just finished the popular climb when Sylvester Stallone came up and said, "You guys are fast. You're making me look bad." Stallone is back in Philly shooting the latest Rocky movie. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.